Character as fate. That is the theme that connects Homer, Joyce and Jung. I'm going to take advantage of the format of these afternoon talks to present not a scientific paper, but a story that slowly unfolds. Surprisingly, as far as I can make out, it has never been approached from this analytic position, though it is known about in literary circles. I first read the Odyssey as a schoolboy, but it wasn't until some years ago that I rather self-consciously took it on holiday with me to Greece. Suddenly I became interested in Odysseus' ability to get things wrong and to make impulsive mistakes. I could easily identify with that. Odysseus was a mythical hero that I could, as an analyst, believe in. I began to see there was a pattern to his journeys, of which the mistakes were an important part, and that Odysseus was not only searching for a passage home, but was also searching for a greater awareness of himself. The Odyssey has a definite narrative structure, though chronologically it's jumbled. It falls roughly into two halves. The first is concerned with Odysseus' return from Troy to his home in Ithaca. On the way, he encounters various mythical figures, such as the nymph Calypso, Circe, Polyphemus, the giant Cyclops, the Sirens, and Scylla and Charybdis, who are all treated as real inhabitants of the external world. During this first half of the story, Odysseus stays for many years in different settings. Not counting the 9 years spent fighting in Troy, he spends another 7 years ensnared by Calypso, and another year with Circe. This dallying must have been very noticeable to the Homeric Greeks, for they would have known that all the sailing in the Odyssey could have been completed in 1 year's season of sailing. They only sailed from about May to September, I understand. So that this waiting is apparently the opposite of heroic action. But on the scale in the Odyssey, it is heroic, and it's an integral part of the story and the heroic task. But if the Odyssey was only consisted of the first half, Odysseus would be seen as a failure, and also irrational, being blown about the Mediterranean by internal forces, impulse-driven, or by their split-off projected counterparts. His task contains uncertainty. He does not know, for example, before setting out, the success or failure of his passage between Scylla and Charybdis. The heroes of other mythologies take similar risks, not always seeing the goal of the journey. If it is visible, the means to it are not, and the hero has to improvise, often with the help of the gods, who would, in a psychotherapeutic setting, equate with the self. Despair is usually the hero's lot. He often loses his possessions, and Odysseus is rather good at that, and his family is taken away from him, and gifts that are given, like Ino's veil, which helped Odysseus survive a shipwreck, have to be given back. Usually the hero is entirely on his own, though Odysseus is only occasionally so. The hero severs ties with those of the past, but is occasionally accompanied by a faithful servant, such as Don Giovanni's Leporello or Don Quixote's Sancho Panza. These may be considered as surrogate personalities of the hero, gallantly bearing all those down-to-earth qualities the hero himself so desperately needs. Odysseus, in his turn, gets through a couple of boatloads of faithful crewmen, and those living close to heroes know how dangerous it is. Between the two very different halves of the Odyssey lies a pivotal passage, the descent into Hades. It is similar perhaps to the Negrido in the alchemical series, and I'm sure that Homer was quite conscious of its central place in his work. Although Odysseus' father, son and wife get major starring roles, his mother is almost entirely neglected. In the Hades section, however, he is told that his mother has died and now resides there. His grieving is brief, though genuine. From the developmental point of view, the Odyssey may be seen as a symbolic attempt first to make conscious and then to separate from infantile roots and attachment to mother. The first half has pre-Oedipal material, the fantasies and so on. The second, Oedipal material. Now, I noticed particularly that his separation from mother was from her as container. And one vivid account of this is when Odysseus, in order to sail past the Sirens without being drawn fatally to them, commands his men, whose own ears have been stuffed with wax unlike him, to bind him to the mast. It is significant that he opts for the difficult choice of hearing the Sirens and being immobilized. The result of such a containment, the binding to the mast, is that the desire for the Sirens is made painfully conscious, but not acted upon. The binding is a kind of enactment of ego strength, or the ego strength that Odysseus is aiming for. It is not denial of the desire, or acting in order not to feel. Perhaps one may look on it as the desire to hear and the desire to hold back simultaneously. And here I think one is getting closer to the ability of the self to contain the opposites. It may result in a feeling of being driven crazy by desire. There are several passages in the Odyssey where such feelings are expressed, from the pains of hunger to the longing for Penelope to the more ethereal episode with the Sirens. The containment described, that is what happens outside the mother-infant couple, becomes important again later on when I discuss Joyce and Jung. The final point I wish to make about the Odyssey is concerning the apparent mistakes that Odysseus and his crew make. He is no longer the successful general at Troy. He is now a poor leader. For example, he lets his own men open Pandora's box, which results in a considerably lengthened journey home. Looked at in a teleological way, however, it can be said that Odysseus was still too much of the impulsive warrior to go home. He has to have, further in quotes, therapy. Although at times he is still ruthless and cunning, he is faced with situations where these are no longer helpful. He has to suffer and he has to feel. The general is brought to the most humiliating circumstances, largely through his own actions. The intellect can be used to avoid authentic experience, helplessness and other painful feelings. In the Odyssey, Odysseus gets himself into situations where the intellect itself is helpless. It's a non-analytic attempt at tackling false self structures. The heroic task results in a greater consciousness, and that is why the end cannot be seen from the beginning, because at the start it is still unconscious. It is a movement towards individuation, towards becoming whole, of becoming aware of one's own unique self. But I do not wish to propagate the idea of the self in the analytic sense as being wonderful. It contains an equal amount of destructiveness as creativeness. The shadow somehow has to be integrated. By making mistakes caused because of his shadow, Odysseus is brought face to face with it. And that is why I've called this talk The Hero as Healer. Have a little drink. The Odyssey, after a few centuries of being transmitted orally, was put down in writing around, I believe, about 600 BC. And from there it's remained in the foreground or the crannies of civilization. First in Greek libraries, then in Roman ones, then finally in monastic ones. Over 2,000 years after its being written down, Monteverdi composed an opera on the return of Ulysses. By then the Romance languages had changed Odysseus's name. Chapman at the beginning of the 17th century translated it. Then John Keats wrote a poem on Chapman's translation. The literary bandwagon was already rolling. In 1932, the modernist version of Ulysses was published by James Joyce. Joyce was born in 1882, only 7 years younger than Jung, and is roughly, therefore, a contemporary of him. His father, John Joyce, was at this time a rate collector, a minor civil servant. And my information in this talk from now on comes from two sources, mainly from Joyce's biographer, Richard Ellman, but also from a more recent publication on Joyce's wife, Nora, written by Brenda Maddox. Ellman's account is very academic and rather dry and full of quotations. Brenda Maddox's is very much more a feminine account and provides a lot more feelings. Both are necessary. Joyce's father was an alcoholic reprobate. 1 year before James Joyce's birth, there was a stillborn baby, and in this James shared the same fate as another artist, Van Gogh. It was another 2 years before James's first sister was born, and Ellman describes his father's two abilities at this time as conceiving babies and mortgaging his property. He ended up with 10 children and 11 mortgages. When James was only 9, his father was pensioned off at the early age of 42, and it's likely that he'd been caught manipulating the figures, highly likely, and was lucky to get a pension at all. But from then on, the family fortunes went downhill, and the family ended up flitting from rented accommodation to rented accommodation, sometimes literally in the moonlight. To James, home life became a continual crisis, averted from disaster by pawnbroker, obliging friend, or sudden short-lived job for father. Joyce Sr. drank more and more heavily, and said if he didn't have such a large family to support, he could drink even more. He was hostile to his second son, Stanislaus, and indifferent to the rest except James, and the youngest, Mabel. James, in true Oedipal style, once had to stop his father from strangling his mother in a drunken fit. The father, even in the poorest surroundings, tried to maintain the appearance of a gentleman. For example, he carried around his various houses the family portraits in oils, and also a phony family coat of arms, all of which were inherited by James and put faithfully in his flat in Paris. It's difficult to know why James so liked his father and used his character and sayings in so much of his work. He said hundreds of pages and scores of characters came from him. But Joyce Sr. was obviously one of the world's great raconteurs, with an exact sense of timing, emphasis and double meanings. The father was known in Dublin for his wit and tenor voice, and in spite of all that drinking survived to over 80, surrounded by photographs and press cuttings of his famous son, who had not seen him for the last 20 years of his life. There is not, unfortunately, very much evidence on the emotional side of James's development. We know nothing for sure about his early relationship with his mother, though he was very moved by her death when she died when he was at 21. She was obviously quite a disciplinarian, but passively accepted the Church's teaching on contraception, and she had, as I said, 10 living children, but several other miscarriages as well, being pregnant, therefore, nearly every year. I'm wary of taking Joyce's writings as evidence of his early development, especially the portrait of the artist as a young man, as others have done. There's a professor, an American professor, Britvick, who's used it quite a lot. I think it's important, however, that within 10 months of his mother's death, he met with and eloped with Nora Barnacle, who was to stay with him till he died. So it seems he could not go for long without the feminine as container. But this is jumping ahead of the story. At the age of 6.5, James's father sent him to what was considered to be the best school in Ireland, Clongowes, if that's how it's pronounced, a Jesuit school. James's brother Stanislaus remembered him as being happy at school. He certainly won many medals for athletics and, needless to say, did very well academically. His book, Portrait of the Artist, contradicts his brother's view, making for me the creative work suspect as a true picture, though it's possible for Joyce to have been a good achiever at school, in spite of severe unhappiness. But when it was written, when Joyce was about 27, he was by then ardently anti-Catholic. He left that school at 9.5 when his father was retired, but returned to another Jesuit college, Belvedere, aged 12, where, assigned the topic My Favourite Hero, he chose Ulysses, of whom he had already read in Lamb's The Adventures of Ulysses. He had his first sexual experience with a prostitute at the age of 14 by a canal in Dublin, and apart from one short-lived religious revival, continued to frequent brothels until his elopement. At the age of 17, he received a prize of £3 for the best composition in English for the whole of Ireland. He then went to study at University College Dublin and was by now more or less fluent in Italian and French. While still a student, he favourably reviewed one of Ibsen's plays in the Dublin press, which drew forth a letter of thanks from Ibsen himself. Joyce was already launched on his European crusade. By his mid-20s, he had read virtually every important work in modern European literature. Similarly, Jung, when starting out on his career as an intern at the Bergholzli Hospital, read through the 50 volumes of the Allgemeine Zeitschrift für Psychiatrie. Joyce's own interest in being a writer was coming alive, and he began modestly enough by writing short pieces called Epiphanies. After leaving college, he decided to study medicine to earn a living in order to write, and as he couldn't support himself in Dublin, he thought of teaching English in Paris in order to study medicine in order to write. Needless to say, this was bound to fail, and he soon returned to Dublin. This was partly because his mother was ill and dying. Lady Gregory was one of the patrons to whom he wrote for funds at this time, but he was also soon to meet George Russell, Arthur Symons and W.B. Yeats, and many others in London on his way to and from Paris. Paris was thus the first and last place of his life in exile. Joyce needed exile, to quote Ellman, as a reproach to others and as a justification of himself. His feeling of ostracism from Dublin lacked, as he was well aware, the moral decisiveness of his hero Dante's exile from Florence, in that, unlike Dante, Joyce kept the keys to the gate. He was neither bidden to leave nor forbidden to return, and indeed, after his departure, was to go back 5 times. After the elopement with Nora, they settled eventually in Trieste for a number of years. Nora was an urban girl from Galway. She was street smart and had a sharp tongue. At the age of 2 or 5, there is no certainty of this, she was fostered out from home and went to live with her grandparents nearby, so that she obviously had quite a lot of contact with her mother, but she never forgave her mother for turning her out as she felt from the house. She left school at about the age of 13, and when Joyce met her, she was a chambermaid. He said he didn't like intellectual women, and Nora was never that, though she was obviously quite clever and developed a great interest for the opera. It's possible Joyce felt he had more control over someone not as well educated as himself. but the facts are that he spent the rest of his life surrounded by intellectual women. In Trieste, Joyce taught at the Berlitz language school and established a kind of routine, getting drunk nearly every evening, with drinking only after 6 o'clock. He never looked upon himself as alcoholic because he said he never drank until 6 o'clock. But when he did drink, he would start off with white wine. Well, he drank only white wine, and he would drink several bottles every evening, very often to unconsciousness. He contrived at this time with some skill, and for the rest of his life actually, not to be able to live on his income, on which he could have been comfortably middle class, though perhaps in the lower reaches. Eating out every evening was one way of reducing themselves to poverty. He also became a dandy in his dress, and if he felt too affluent, could easily pick an expensive piece of furniture. Begging letters, at which Joyce was by now very skilful, flew back and forth to Dublin and London. His brother Stanislaus arrived in Trieste to help increase the budget by teaching himself, but to little avail. Stanislaus's own account of their relationship was entitled My Brother's Keeper, which tells its own story. They nevertheless were constantly on the brink of disaster, Joyce always hoping that his stories or reviews would sell. For the remaining 38 years of his life, he was never self-supporting, and eventually was given a large endowment by Harriet Shaw Weaver, which he did his best to work through rapidly. In 1988, Brenda Maddox says this sum that he got in I think about the mid-20s was equivalent to £400,000. So it really was a tidy sum of money that he got through. And in this respect, he repeated his father's incontinent life. So I think this gives some indication of Joyce's need for immediate gratification at an oral level and his almost total lack of containment. Another benefactress was Mrs. Harold McCormick, daughter of John D. Rockefeller, Sr. She it was who was analysed by Jung during World War I, and she funded the start of the Analytical Psychology Club in Zurich. Joyce somehow always managed to find a ledge on which to perch, no matter how frequently he threw himself in true heroic style into the chasm. In Trieste, he collected a following of devoted friends who initially came to learn English. One of them was a doctor who delivered his first child, Giorgio, born in 1905, when Joyce was 23. Looking for more constant work, he went to Rome, worked in a bank, and then came back to Trieste, where only his previous debts and his brother were waiting to meet him. His book, Dubliners, was already written and going through what was to become the usual Joyce problems of finding a publisher willing to publish what was then thought of as pornographic. Back in Trieste, his writing, teaching and drinking continued. In the summer of 1907, he developed rheumatic fever, the result, he thought, of too many nights spent in the gutter. While he was in one ward recovering in the hospital, his wife gave birth to their daughter, Lucia, in the paupers' ward. So Lucia, who's another main figure in this paper, was born into very difficult circumstances. Nora was less well supported than when Giorgio was born, and unlike with Giorgio, she was unable to breastfeed Lucia. Joyce was at this time working on a book called Stephen Hero, is now aged 25, which later was considerably changed and became Portrait of the Artist as a young man. But he was also, at the birth of his daughter, preparing himself to write Ulysses, and I think the connection with Lucia's birth is significant. By 1915, with Italy involved in the First World War, Joyce fled with his family to Zurich. One of the control officers at the Italian border, needless to say, was one of his ex-pupils. Zurich at that time held an extraordinary mixture of expatriates, including Tristan Tzara, leader of the Dadaists, Lenin, and of course Jung, who was somewhat in retirement, going through his confrontation with the unconscious. In Zurich, Jung was to write the bulk of Ulysses, flitting as usual from flat to flat, finishing it in Paris. He himself said it was written in 20 different lodgings. They usually rented 2-bedroom flats, with Giorgio sleeping in one room and Lucia sleeping with her parents. This practice was certainly still going on when she was 15 years old, and Brenda Maddox points out the horrors of this for Lucia. The children were loved very dearly, but were not, in normal respects, reared. They were not prepared for any sort of career away from home. Joyce never had a desk on which to write at this stage. The manuscript of Ulysses on which he was working was kept in a suitcase. When he wrote, he sat in an armchair in the drawing room, with the suitcase on top of his knees. Ulysses was then written on top of the suitcase. I do not think it's too fanciful to compare Joyce's suitcase, containing his imaginary world, with Jung's wooden box, in which he placed the mannequin in his attic at home when he was young. Both, I think, provided containment and safety for their most important symbols. When Jung was feeling ill at ease, when his school activities had taken him away from himself, he would visit the attic and deposit a scroll written in a secret language. The scrolls made a library for the mannequin. In this way, not only Jung's symbol felt safe, but Jung himself felt safe. Although there is no proof, I feel sure Joyce used the Ulysses suitcase in the same way. In Paris especially, with the publication of Ulysses in 1922, Joyce was to become an international figure in a group of international writers and artists. He had a happy knack of being at the centre of the battle, first in Zurich and now in Paris, which itself was to become one of the centres of modernism. Here, often in the bookshop of Sylvia Beach and Adrienne Monnier, he would meet the other heroes, Eliot and Pound, Hemingway and Wyndham Lewis, and that essential Joycean crew of publishers and devotees and moneylenders. Here too his eyesight began to fail, after repeated attacks of iritis, so that he was almost blind when he died, a condition also attributed to Homer. Joyce's Ulysses, which most people would say was his greatest book, is too big a subject for this paper, but a brief mention is necessary. It is actually quite difficult to read, though a book by Stuart Gilbert explaining it is a great help. Joyce transferred the 19 years of the Odyssey in the Mediterranean to one day in the life of Leopold Bloom in Dublin, namely June the 16th, 1904. This was the day Joyce met his wife, and henceforth it was to be celebrated in his circle as Bloom's Day, right until his death. Today it is good-naturedly celebrated in Dublin itself, with many people, some dressed in costume of the period, repeating the journey that Bloom made. Bloom has a foil in the shape of young Stephen Dedalus, Joyce's Telemachus. Their journeys and thoughts interweave throughout the book, repeating most of the Odyssey, meeting with Circe, the Sirens, the Cyclops, etc., in their Dublinesque forms. Bloom's Penelope is his wife Molly, and her suitors are represented by one Blazes Boylan, with whom Molly sings in concerts. The final word of the book is given to Molly as she enters a reverie before sleep, which lasts for many pages, in one famous unpunctuated sentence. Joyce was an innovator, and his innovations partly concern form. Each of the 18 books of Ulysses are presided over by 6 features, and I'll describe the Sirens episode. There, the features are as follows. The scene is the concert room. The hour of the day is 4 p.m. The organ of the body is the ear. The art is music. The symbol is barmaids, and the technique is the fugue. And each of the other 18 books has a similar structure to it. So you can imagine already it's starting to get a bit complicated. Joyce also developed the idea of the internal monologue in Ulysses, so that Bloom, Stevens and Molly's thoughts and thought processes could be shown. This was a considerable advance on the use only of dialogue and a description of a character's behaviour. It allows the reader a more intense identification with the characters, including, I suspect, projective identification. Interior monologue was first used by a rather obscure 19th century symbolist French writer called Dujardin, but needless to say it was Joyce with his omnivorous reading who found it and developed it and made it into a commonplace literary device. I think it's quite remarkable that while Joyce was working on the interior monologue, Jung, only a few miles away, was developing active imagination. Both were concerned with the internal world. Fordham has written a very complex analysis of active imagination, where he shows that transitional phenomena lie at the root of it, and thus it can be related to separations, especially from mother. The comparison of these two techniques, interior monologue and active imagination, requires a whole paper in itself. But it's my belief that Jung had the edge over Joyce. For although Joyce originally thought that interior monologue revealed the unconscious, it remains a literary device, and therefore only does not really give the author any extra evidence of his own thinking. It is also not a private possession. It's written for the public, which is unlike the transitional object. It's therefore clear that whatever active imagination is, Jung used it fairly successfully to confront his own psychotic processes. Joyce in Ulysses also began to introduce into his own work neologisms, new words. Usually there were two well-known words run together, such as moon-weak, heart-scalded, all-important. He also described the sea as snot-green and scrotum-tightening. After Ulysses, Joyce went on to write Finnegan's Wake, a book even more difficult to make a synopsis of than Ulysses. It concerns a symbolic father figure, H.C. Earwicker, or Earwig in English, and otherwise known in the book in French as Pierce Oreille, to get inside the ear, or in Irish Perce O'Reilly. Other characters are Shem the penman, who was Joyce, and Sean the postman, the disseminator, who was his brother Stanislaus. The book is a dream of Earwicker's wife-mother, called Anna Livia Pluribel. It's, I think, not a coincidence that her initials ALP, which occur quite a lot throughout the book, are also the first letters of Alf the Sacred River. She is not only the River Liffey running through Dublin to the sea, but also all rivers everywhere, collecting her tributaries, and therefore her dispersed and disintegrating sons and lovers, before being absorbed in the ocean, the great oneness. It's a deeply moving and compassionate metaphor, but it also ominously prefigures fragmentation. Now, I bought, a friend has lent me an early edition of it before the whole book was published, and I'll pass it round for you to have a look at. It isn't, please don't tear the page, it's uncut as yet, and I know you'd be very upset if you open them, but do have a look to see. You can get some idea of the density of the language in that. Joyce's method of writing was to put down fairly simple Irish sentences to which accretions attached over the years. And there are examples of, you can actually see his notebooks in the British Museum when they're out. And over a double-page spread of an exercise book, he'd write down only 1/4 down the right-hand column. He'd write his sentence. And then as time went by, he'd fill in with little balloons and things like that, the whole of the rest of the page, with additions and so on. But his method was anyway to write a lot by association. And a vast amount was written of both Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake after it was already in page proofs. This is one of the fragments that was published fairly early on, but the whole work of Finnegan's Wake took 17 years. The accretions were polyglot, like Joyce. Every other word is a pun or neologism in many languages, including, of course, all the common Indo-European ones, but also Russian, Norwegian, which Joyce learned from Sea Captain, Burmese and Hindi. One of the words taken from this, the quark, has been used for subatomic particles. The result is a more or less meaningless surface texture, which has to be listened to as well as read to be understood. I'm sure there's a word for this in information theory, but it's like a chord of music where many notes are heard at once, but can also, by the right ear, be simultaneously separated. Finnegan's Wake was published in 1939. Joyce had 2 years left to live, dying in 1941 of complications from a perforated duodenal ulcer. He was 58. From a drunken layabout in Trieste, he'd become one of the great modernists of the 20th century. But over this heroic task was cast a shadow that had Jungian dimensions and connections. His daughter Lucia, in her mid-20s, had become psychotic and was to remain in and out of institutions for the rest of her life, the last 35 years being spent in St Andrews, Northampton. She'd had artistic leanings, at first wanting to become a ballet dancer, and performed in several semi-professional productions. In her mid-20s in Paris, she was obviously a vulnerable young woman, often taken advantage of in an era of sexual liberty. Nora remonstrated with her. Joyce, perhaps, remembering his own youth, was silent. One brief lover, and she had many, was Alexander Calder, the sculptor and inventor of the mobile. But Lucia was becoming more openly ill and confused. She fell in love with Samuel Beckett, infatuated with him. He was visiting Joyce every afternoon at this time. Beckett, who knew a mad person when he saw one, refused to get involved. Joyce was offended and blamed Beckett for the disturbance, and their friendship ceased for several years. On Joyce's 50th birthday, when Joyce was receiving international congratulations on the telephone, Lucia cut the telephone wires twice, saying, "C'est moi qui ai l'artiste." There were other precipitating factors. She had recently been very hurt to discover that her parents were not married, and that she was therefore illegitimate. Her brother Giorgio was at this time getting married. Giorgio had always been Nora's favourite, and Lucia Joyce's. It was therefore at Nora that Lucia threw a chair, and it fell to Giorgio to take Lucia to a sanatorium. Joyce and Nora refused to certify her, and she wandered in and out of treatment for some 2 or 3 years. Once she was found living rough in Dublin. Once she stayed a virtual prisoner in Gloucester Place near Baker Street with Miss Weaver while she was undergoing some kind of private treatment. Joyce never forgave Miss Weaver, this was about 1935, for saying that Lucia was incurable. After many doctors and hospitalizations, the 20th doctor she saw was Jung. What were Joyce's feelings about analysis? As early as 1912, when Joyce was about 30, Joyce possessed works by Freud and Jung, though he felt the philosopher Vico knew more than both of them and had got there centuries beforehand. Mrs. McCormick, who you may remember funded both the club in Zurich and Joyce, tried in 1918 to get Joyce to be analysed by Jung. Joyce refused, and when he did so, Mrs. McCormack withdrew her financial support. Joyce blamed Jung, saying it was Jung's attempt to stop Joyce's chronic money-wasting habits, though it seemed the two at this time had not met. And in typical Joyce fashion, the whole episode turned up later in Finnegan's Wake. Jung, for his part, had started to read Ulysses when it first came out in 1922, but was asked in 1930 to write a preface to the German edition of Stuart Gilbert's book on Ulysses. They shared the same publisher. Jung's essay must be one of the least attractive of his works. He approached Ulysses with a 19th century expectation of a novel, and therefore totally failed to understand its innovative form. In his words, the characters in it were very real, but had no egos. The book gave the reader an irritating sense of inferiority, etc., etc. He said, it was written by a tapeworm. You could read it as well backwards as forwards. Jung, in a letter to Sir Herbert Reed in 1960, linked Joyce and Picasso as masters of fragmentation, saying, in Ulysses, a world comes down in an almost endless, breathless stream of debris. He was a bit more mealy-mouthed when writing directly to Joyce in 1932, but didn't hesitate to say how bored he was with Ulysses, as well as being a little bit admiring. Joyce's reaction to Jung's essay was to publish it in order to ridicule Jung. Later he was to say that Jung read it without a single smile. In such a case, he said, the best thing to do was to change one's drink. So 2 years later, when his daughter saw Jung, Joyce was not favourably disposed, but thought Jung might help her, even if he himself wouldn't go to Jung. Joyce found it difficult anyway to believe in Lucia's madness. Of all her relatives, he was the only one to follow her psychotic leaps and bounds of thought. Lucia had been mute with other doctors. We do not know, as far as I know anyway, have any record of Jung's treatment of her. But Sir Lawrence van der Post asked Jung how he had treated mute schizophrenics in the Berkholtzli hospital, and I expect his method had not changed much 20 years later when he saw Lucia. And I quote from Sir Lawrence, when faced with persons who had not uttered a word for years, he would refuse to accept defeat. Watching them closely when he saw some frowning or other expression appear on their faces, or even just an unwarranted gesture accomplished with their hands, he would repeat as best he could the expression and gesture himself, trying to think at the same time of the first thing his act of imitation brought to mind. He would then put it into words to the patient, and was amazed how often thereby he established contact. The silence was broken, and in time a dialogue was established that led to a cure more often than he dared hope for, and certainly at a rate that Berkholtzli had never experienced. All of this, of course, needed not only confidence, for how could anyone have been competent in so strange and unexplored a region? It needed moral courage of the highest order. Michael Fordham confirms that he personally knew 2 or 3 people from severe psychotic illnesses who had recovered after treatment by Jung. Jung had an initial success with Lucia. He was able to get her to speak too, but unfortunately was unable to keep his hold. Lucia said later, To think that such a materialistic Swiss man could try to get a hold of my soul. I think that shows something of the difficulty between them. She was probably right to think that Jung was interested in her soul, but I'm not sure about the materialistic Swiss man. Could it have been that in her psychotic way she was intuiting Jung's inferior function? Jung pointed out to Joyce the schizophrenic elements in Lucia's poems, the portmanteau words and the neologisms. Joyce replied they anticipated a new literature, and they were anyway very similar to his own work in Finnegan's Wake. To which Jung answered that Joyce's use of neologisms in Finnegan's Wake was conscious and intentional, unlike Lucia's, which was not. He was convinced that Joyce was harbouring a latent psychosis, kept at bay by his drinking. He said Joyce and Lucia were like two people going to the bottom of the river, one falling and the other diving. Had he intuited that Joyce was writing about a river called Anna Livia Pluribel? Jung formulated his position neatly in a letter written in 1955. Joyce's own anima was so solidly identified with her Lucia that to have her certified would have been as much an admission that he himself had a latent psychosis. There is some evidence that Jung was right. On one occasion, when Lucia went into hospital, Joyce had auditory hallucinations. And it seemed the family system had to have within it a psychosis. But I'm not 100% convinced of this, and will later put forward an alternative view. Jung eventually said Lucia was a very exceptional case, which pleased Joyce narcissistically. However, Jung said that she was not therefore suitable for analytic treatment. She died in St Andrew's Hospital, Northampton, I think in 1984, after spending the war in occupied France in a hospital in Brittany. Dan Jones, a psychiatrist who looked after her in Northampton, described her to me as a white-haired old lady who played the piano rather well. It was not always like that. The violence towards Nora made it impossible for her to visit Lucia, while Joyce, to his credit, visited her weekly when she lived nearby in the sanatoria. And there is further evidence she was still quite violent at times in Northampton. Now, my thesis is brief. It is that Joyce was unable to use the hero archetype as healer. And because of this, his daughter interjected a severely distorted father figure, a father who was an archetype. It's possible that Homer gave a picture of himself at the end of the Odyssey as a white-haired blind troubadour, sitting in a corner in the hall of suitors. But Joyce was more than this. He was not only Homer, but he identified himself with Odysseus, the hero. We have noticed his choice of the Odyssey in his schoolboy days. Ellman says Joyce linked himself to Odysseus as pacifist, father, wanderer, musician and artist. Quite a lot of identification. Indeed, it is also possible to say that with Joyce's Ulysses, a couple has been formed of hero and down-to-earth companion, with Joyce the literary hero and Bloom the companion, carrying the ordinariness that Joyce lacked. Besides identifying with the hero, Joyce engaged wholeheartedly in the heroic tasks which I described earlier. In the early days in Trieste, he was very much leaving behind those who were close to him in Dublin and going it alone. Like Odysseus, he was able to wait. Ulysses from conception to publication took at least 12 years and Finnegan's Wake 17. He had a go at separating from his mother in his foray to Paris after university, and I do see this as more than a geographical dislocation. But it was not a great success. As I said, on her death, instead of becoming a better container for himself, where he could withdraw some of his projections onto her, he found within a short while another container in the person of Nora. His greatest heroic achievement and success were in the innovations in style and form that he brought about. I believe that a new form can bring about a change in what is said. Thus Joyce, like the hero, was going into unknown territory, taking a risk for all of us to enjoy, like the other great modernists, Picasso, Matisse, Stravinsky, Henry Moore. He also had the courage to put his work out into the public arena to face ridicule. Or was it courage? Was it not straightforward omnipotence that drove Joyce on? Here we come perhaps to the failure of Joyce. In infancy, we have fantasies and wishes of omnipotence. Analysis shows the importance of the mother in meeting these fantasies and slowly allowing disillusionment, hopefully within the infant's capacities, so that depressive anxieties do not overwhelm. Most of us reach adulthood with our omnipotent fantasies, tempered to a greater or lesser extent by reality. But some, and I suggest Odysseus is one of them, reach adulthood with too much omnipotence intact. Kohut has spoken about this in terms of the grandiose self, on top of which Odysseus really had superior abilities, reinforcing his overinflated self-image. His Odyssey brought him down and put him in touch with failure and the maladaptiveness of his omnipotent fantasies, in the same way that analysis helps at its best to deflate the grandiose patience. Hence our title, Shrink. The waiting in the Odyssey is part of the process of shrinkage, and for Odysseus to experience imprisonment by the giant Cyclops was a step towards being conscious of being imprisoned by his own grandiose desires. This then is the nature of the mistakes that the hero brings upon himself. In saying that, I'm implying that the so-called mistakes are purposefully brought about by another part of the hero, not the conscious ego, but the self, that demands wholeness rather than heroics. The hero is first and foremost fighting himself for himself, albeit, as so often with Odysseus, in a projected form. Unfortunately, the cure is not always successful, and Joyce is a case in point. That the dynamics of Joyce's psyche was driven by omnipotent thoughts and wishes is not really in question. A quick look at his collected letters is enough to dispel any doubts. He had to be the best, the greatest. Ezra Pound remarked to Eliot that Joyce had such marvellous manners in company and was so polite. But Eliot was more perspicacious. He said that the politeness hid an enormous arrogance. Joyce, when young, felt the world owed him a living because he was. With enormous energy and diligence, he transformed this into the world owing him a living because he was a genius. Finnegan's Wake is so packed full of learning, symbol and fact, that no one is allowed to mistake the greatness of Joyce. It is indeed great. It is an indescribable feat of heroism, but it was during the writing of it that Lucia became psychotic. It's not that the hero in Joyce did not bring him down to face the infant aspects of himself. I've already mentioned his nights spent in the gutters of Rome and Trieste. His lifelong drive to poverty is another example. Even when he was 50, Harriet Weaver was remonstrating with him over his spending as to a little boy over pocket money. The problem is that he always escaped from the lesson by being a genius and by intellect, by cunning and tricksterism. Joyce was a great trickster, especially having the charm and ability to con money out of his friends. He was aware that Dante put Odysseus in hell because of the episode with the wooden horse, presumably because of the deceit. On several occasions, acknowledgement of Joyce's failure was avoided by his taking the position that those around him had betrayed him. For example, Lucia was not becoming ill, but Beckett had deserted Joyce, thus making her unhappy. He always felt Ireland had betrayed him too, and in this area he exhibited more primitive defences like denial and splitting, and was quite paranoid about Ireland. But, of course, the intellect was his great escape. As Ellman points out, the heroism of Bloom is entirely mental. Joyce never got himself, like Odysseus, into a position where his intellect was helpless. Usually it was quite the reverse. It was only when confronted by Lucia's psychosis that his intellect was flawed. Here Jung, who had made an attempt to confront his unconscious, had an advantage. Jung could see what was going on, while Joyce had to relapse into rationalisation and denial. It's a bit unfair on Joyce. I know he was within the family dynamics. I also wish to add here the possibility of enactment of the container as a defence against fragmentation. I have already mentioned the symbolic use of the suitcase that contained Ulysses while it was being written. It has struck me as significant that Joyce's earlier style was very psychological. This includes Dublin's Portrait of the Artist and his marvellous intense play called Exiles. They were held together by psychological dynamic forces. This is not so for Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. These are held together by enormous conceptual structures, and I postulate that this surrogate framework helped to hold Joyce together. It's also possible to see Lucia as the container into which Joyce projected her psychosis. This is along the lines of Jung. She could not digest and metabolize it, that is her father's psychosis, causing her eventual breakdown. Litz in the USA, who's worked with such psychotic families, where the child is an adjunct of the parent to protect the parent's instability. Lucia could not progress into an autonomous life of her own because, in rather crude terms, she would have to hand back to her father his psychosis. She could not regress, for this pushed her back upon an engulfing, unstable parent. Lucia was born between Joyce's psychological style and his structural style. Now, if Joyce was not obviously psychotic, is it possible that we might describe him today as having a narcissistic personality, and that this is what Lucia had to protect? Aldous Huxley said that Joyce insisted on a 13th century etymology of the Greek form of Odysseus. Joyce said it was a combination of Utis, meaning nobody, and Zeus, meaning God. But these are the two poles around which Joyce swung. Finnegan's Wake is written in every language, and yet in reality it is no language. In order not to feel a nobody, he became a literary god. I believe it is possible that Joyce suffered from severe feelings of emptiness. Drinking, writing, and his family kept these at bay. After finishing Finnegan's Wake, his own life and the world was in ruins. Lucia was in a sanatorium, and Giorgio's wife Helen was suffering from extremely severe manic depressive breakdowns. World War II was declared 9 months after the publication of Finnegan's Wake. European life was in that awful limbo awaiting the cataclysm. He no longer had the composition of Finnegan's Wake to make him laugh. Meaningless and emptiness took over, and he began to suffer increasingly from the peptic ulcer from which he eventually died. Reconstructing Joyce's infancy, it is possible to say that he was unable to create a sense of worthiness about himself at a pre-Oedipal level. This may have been caused by the problems of having a stillborn older sibling. Was his mother still affected by it? Ellman emphasises Joyce's passivity and horror of violence, but he fails to see Joyce's verbal aggression and violence. It may be that the infant Joyce was unable to manage his oral sadism, and this is where the containing of abilities of the mother are significant. Whatever the cause, there is enough evidence to show that Joyce had deep insecurities arising from the earliest levels. These were then carried forward, causing disruption at the Oedipal phase. The evidence for all of this is overwhelming, not so much or not only in the writing, but especially in the biography and the letters. This then is the trap that I think Joyce was within. He developed an identification with the hero to compensate for the feelings of being a nobody. But the hero, in the healing role, by throwing him repeatedly into the gutter, kept forcing him to face the helplessness and the narcissistic wounds of his infancy. The regression did not return him to safe ground where he could feel whole and mend the damage. I believe that this is what the literary god was trying to protect, and this was the task his loving daughter, Lucia, found beyond her. Now, I'm going to conclude with a quotation from Jung, just in case there's a feeling that I've given that Jung could have done it differently. The fact that many a man who goes his own way ends in ruin means nothing. He must obey his own law, as if it were a demon whispering to him of new and wonderful paths. There are not a few who are called awake by the summons of the voice, whereupon they are at once set apart from the others, feeling themselves confronted with a problem about which the others know nothing. In most cases, it is impossible to explain to the others what has happened, for any understanding is walled off by impenetrable prejudices. You are no different from anybody else, they will chorus, or there's no such thing, or even if there is such a thing, it is immediately branded as morbid. He is at once set apart and isolated, as he is resolved to obey the law that commands him from within. His own law, everybody will cry. But he knows better. It is the law.